This podcast is brought to you by the Association for Coaching, the world's leading international professional body which is advancing coaching in business and society worldwide. I'm your host, Simone Sweeney, and in this new series, Getting Started as a Coach, I'm excited to introduce you to experts and coaching thought leaders who will share their passion and experience to help new and aspiring coaches get the insight and information they need to understand the industry, make more informed decisions, and successfully start out in the world of coaching. In today's episode of Getting Started as a New Coach, I'm joined by Michelle Lucas. Michelle helps me to learn more about the world of coaching tools and techniques. We explore what we mean by tools and techniques, and Michelle invites us to think about tools as a philosophy that will help develop your coaching practice. We explore some of the common coaching tools, as well as how to know when to use them and what tools are right for you. We also talk about some of her favorite tools, and she shares with us her one pearl of wisdom for new coaches. She may very well be familiar to many of our listeners from her work, as well as being a long-term contributor to the Association for Coaches, where most recently she was a supervision education lead. In 2021, the EMCC awarded her their Global Supervision Award. Michelle is undoubtedly a coaching and supervision thought leader. She literally wrote the book on coaching supervision with David Clutterbuck and Carol Whitaker, as well as 101 coaching supervision techniques, approaches, inquiries, and experiments, and her recently published book, Creating the Reflective Habit, a practical guide for coaches, mentors, and leaders. I couldn't think of anyone better to share their wisdom and experience as we explore some of the coaching tools and techniques. Thanks so much for joining us today, Michelle.
Pleasure to be here.
So I'd love to start by asking you, what is your definition of coaching?
Well, see, this is where the benefit of preparation comes in, because I thought, how on earth am I going to offer a definition of coaching? And I'm going to pinch with pride somebody else's work, which is not a definition of coaching, but I think defines coaching. It's a very short poem by Judy Brown, and she says, "No seed grows except by breaking through its own protective coat." And I love that. Because it has kind of Rogerian overtones. If you've ever read any of Roger's work, he talks about potatoes in the cellar reaching for the light, and he talks about the therapist or the coach's job is about creating the right conditions for growth. So there's a real connection there for me about, we believe in our clients that they're resourceful enough to grow on their own. We just have to provide the conditions. And Judy's poem highlights some of the pain that clients go through as they grow, because they have a protective coat. They have to peel it back. Our job as coaches is to create the conditions where they do some of that peeling themselves. I think sometimes we peel it back a bit and some scabs get formed, and then we've got to help them heal. So that would be a lovely definition for coaching, I think. No seed grows except by breaking through its own protective coat.
That's a fantastic metaphor for coaching. It really is, that idea of breaking through and that kind of growth and the kind of implication of there being maybe a little bit of pain or hardship along the way, but that something wonderful will be born and nurtured and grow from it. So I love that definition. Thank you so much for sharing it.
You're welcome.
So when we think about coaching tools and techniques, what does that mean? How can a new coach kind of understand what the tools and techniques of the trade are?
Yeah, well, I hope that anybody that is entering into the world of coaching has had some kind of basic training. And I think, what we're lucky with at the moment in this world is just a smorgasbord of different ways of training to become a coach. Almost always we will leverage from something that went before. So I think tools and techniques, on the one hand, you might already have them in, let's say, your previous career. So, if you've been a leader before and you've done SWOT analysis, guess what? You can probably use a SWOT analysis and convert it for a coaching situation. If you've been a project manager or a communications expert, maybe you've done something like a stakeholder analysis. Guess what? You might be able to use that in coaching. Most coach training organizations will provide some kind of suite of tools or techniques that you'll practice, during the training. And then what I think is useful about that is, in the practice, you'll know which ones seem to work for you and which ones you left a bit cold with. And that's really useful information, because then you can think about, so if this kind of thing works for me, where can I find more like that? And conversely, if something really just feels alien to you, I wouldn't give up on it. It may be that at a different time or place, maybe it could work, but you've got a sense of what things that, whilst they might be interesting to other people, don't really fit your style or your personality or your client base. So our problem, I suspect, as coaches, is there's far many more tools and techniques available than we'll ever get the chance to use.
I think how you're positioning them as coming from the different avenues and experiences of your life, whether it's work or personally or the coach training, is a great reflection for people. And that leads me to wonder, is the use of coaching tools a philosophy, or is it more a coaching method, something that you must do?
Yeah. So again, my own sense of that is that it comes the other way round. So that we work from a philosophy, and when we're clear about that, that might guide us to which tools will fit. So, shameless plug, this book, 101 Coaching Supervision Techniques, and although they're coaching supervision techniques, we put in there how they might apply to coaching. But why I mention it is because that book is designed philosophy first, technique second. My hobby horse in writing that book was, as a supervisor, noticing how many people borrowed techniques without really understanding where that technique originated from, and therefore they didn't apply it in the spirit in which it was intended. So my sense would be, build your philosophy first, and then that will give you a sense of which tools are congruent with that. That's not to say you might not use some tools that are incongruent, but at least you'd be doing that in awareness. And therefore you'd have to prepare your client for a slight shift in emphasis if you were going to use something that, broadly speaking, was from a different philosophy. So I would put philosophy first. That kind of then determines which tools and techniques you might use. And I do think certain philosophies are more tool-oriented than others. So, for example, I hope I'm not doing either philosophy a disservice, but if you think about solution-focused work, there are quite a number of tools that we would place in that domain. So things like scaling questions, the tomorrow question, 5% sentences, all that kind of stuff, which is very, not formulaic, but there is a kind of pattern to how you do that. You compare that with something like Gestalt, and actually that's about really having some concepts in mind as you work, which don't particularly lend themselves to a formula or a particular technique. It's a mindset that guides the conversation. So in Gestalt, those techniques would be looser. In solution focus, they would be tighter. And I'm generalizing, because I'm sure a specialist in either area could give me contrary evidence. But that's my sense. Certain philosophies will lend themselves more to specific techniques, whereas other philosophies lend themselves to more discursive approaches, but they're based on concepts. So, does that help?
It helps enormously. I wish I had had that insight when I was learning about tools. It was one of the pieces of my coach training that I was probably least comfortable with, because it was not something I had used day to day, or even regularly within my professional career before training as a coach. And it then was almost a jarring transition of having sometimes these quite creative or quite starkly different techniques, which are very powerful. And once I was able to kind of lean into them and practice, they became more second nature. But in those early days, I think understanding that a philosophy to the techniques and why they existed and how they could be used and how they followed through of your coaching methodology would have helped a great deal. So I think that's a really great piece of insight for people as they're thinking about coaching or our audience who may be in the earlier days of their coaching career. Working within that kind of theme is, how should a new coach know, or how do you recognize when a tool or a technique should be employed?
Well, that's the $1 million question, isn't it? And yeah. I think the first thing I'd say is, when do you know, your question was, when do you know when a tool can be employed. Very rarely is there ever one right way. So in a way, don't sweat too much that you're picking the right one. It just needs to be good enough to move people forward. And I think, it's the kind of thing that only comes through what I would call visceral experience. So, there's something about when we're practicing, we are coaching with practice clients. That's a fabulous opportunity to experiment with a whole range of tools. And as I was saying earlier, which ones feel like you? Which ones feel like you're shoehorning yourself into somebody else's way of working? You need to know what it feels like to deliver it. And by the same token, you need to be on the receiving end. So I'm a huge believer in the co-coaching community where we get to experience on both sides of the fence what it feels like to deliver things, what it feels like to be on the receiving end. To know, I'm sure I've done it to other people, and people have done it to me when they're offering me something that my brain says that's a perfect coaching question, and it's just landed with an absolute clunk. What does that feel like when you're in the chair and you're thinking, that is so the wrong question for me? So you need to know from both sides what it feels like. And I think the more experience you gather, the more discerning you get about what are the tools might be appropriate in this particular instance. It's never solely our choice either, because if you choose to use something, my sense is we always have to check in with the client about, I've had an idea, maybe this would take us somewhere. What do you think? And trust them. If they go a bit blank, then that's a hint that maybe they don't think it's such a good idea. If they're leaning forward and go, oh yeah. And, then that it's at least worth trying. And I guess what I would say with anybody trying a technique for the first time, first of all, it shouldn't be a first time with a client, is my view. It should be a first time with a peer or a colleague, or at least a practice client. And, always have in the back of your mind, how am I going to back out of this? If this ends with a clunk, or it looks like it's going nowhere and I'm losing the engagement with my client, how am I going to back out of a cul-de-sac and try something else? So there needs to be skill in choosing the tool, practice in working with the tool, and always having a kind of contingency plan. Otherwise you get really wedded to, I just need to try harder and it'll work, when actually what you need to do is let go a little and see what else might come.
I think that aspect of feedback from your client is a critical piece that you've just mentioned, and likely means that you also need to be considerate of any of the tools or techniques or a client's openness to them during the contracting phase.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So is it important for a coach to contract around the potential use of tools and techniques, or wait for that to emerge as the sessions unfold?
Yeah, both and really. Absolutely, we should be, if we intend to use techniques as part of our interventions, then that possibility should be made transparent as early as possible and contracted around, However, if all we did was contract for what we might do, we probably never get into the coaching. So there's something about holding it in our head. If it hasn't been mentioned in the past and we now feel like a particular tool or framework would help, is recontract. Just notice saying, I'm noticing that XYZ might be useful right now, but we've not talked about whether or not that would, bringing in structures and frameworks would be helpful and how you'd like me to do that. So you'd spot contract or do it in the moment. And see what they think.
I think that's a great piece of advice, because often you will see, as you said, someone will almost have an allergic reaction to the concept, or they might be, they might surprise you and themselves by being quite interested and ready to explore. And it's also situational on the day. I've found that sometimes you'll find someone is in a very open frame of mind, or they might be at a point where they are not gaining traction through other mechanisms. So something like a technique could be that breakthrough idea.
And I think we have to be careful with our language as well, because if we say something like, why don't you take this assessment? That might feel very different. So why don't you take this questionnaire? So one might be laden with triggers, the other might be feel much more safe for people. And I'm also very mindful of if we use psychometrics in our repertoire, always remembering that whilst we might be fully trained in them and, careful about how we debrief in them, certainly in my history, there's been many organisations that haven't taken due care around it, and people have had really difficult times absorbing feedback from psychometrics. And that's not our fault, but it is in the client's history and may influence how they imagine doing a psychometric with us might be. So particular care, I would say, if the tool that you have in mind is a psychometric, then contract around that really carefully.
Absolutely. And I think it's great that you are bringing up the psychometric tests and profiles. This is one of the areas that I think for many new coaches is almost a bit of a psychological barrier, because there is so much information about them online. If anyone's on LinkedIn or other social networks, they're likely getting a lot of approaches and requests or sales pitches to become certified in this or in that, and trying to choose which one, as well as indeed trying to understand what they do, was one of the things that I really was spending a great deal of time on early in my practice. Can you give us a little bit of a whirlwind introduction to some of the more common psychometric tools and their place in coaching, if there indeed is something as fixed as a place for them?
Yeah. Well, I think, as with all of these things, it is such a complex market. And so I guess my own journey to coaching was from HR. And as part of that HR journey, there were certain psychometrics that we used as an organization. And, those are my biases because I know, like, and have used them. And I think some of the psychometrics do similar things. The value is in the practitioner's ability to work with them as a conversational tool, not necessarily to sort of know all of the kind of norms and research that goes on behind them and being able to spout that. So it's about the ones that you know well, that you have perhaps found useful yourself. I think there's certainly some in the field of executive coaching. Then you might have either organizations or indeed associate companies that have like a menu of psychometrics that they all will naturally do as part of the intake. So, insights discoveries are something that we hear a lot about. The Hogan tool is also something that we hear a lot about. In my day, it used to be Myers-Briggs. I think that's kind of been overtaken by insights in recent years. And then it depends on your client base. For example, I'm particularly interested in transactional analysis, and a lot of my client work is about people that are trying to manage difficult relationships. There's a tool called TIFF, which is about functional fluency, and it's about how, if you remember the parent, adult, child in transactional analysis, where does our energy naturally go? And so that's brilliant for helping somebody think about, so what is it that I naturally do, and what does that invoke in the people around me, and vice versa. So that's something that isn't particularly well known, but it fits really well with my portfolio because of my interest in the theory behind it. And it is, there are so many to choose from. I think the other thing is that this is me being a little bit of a psychometric snob perhaps, but there's so many tools that aren't recognized by organisations like the British Psychological Society. For tools to get recognised by the BPS, they have to go through a selection criteria. They have to be rigorous. So there's a kind of due diligence that naturally comes with BPS recognised tools. That's not to say that others don't hold that, but if they don't naturally get the stamp of an organisation like that, then I think there's a due diligence on us to say, is this somebody's pet idea that they've just created something around? Or is there some robust research that has helped this be formulated? Because if we're going to offer it to our clients, then I want to believe that it has got rigor and depth and substance, rather than just a fleeting idea that somebody's marketed really well. So, I wouldn't say that everything has to be BPS accredited or don't use it, but I think we need to, as practitioners, we're responsible for ensuring that this is a robust tool.
I think that's fantastic practical guidance, starting with looking at what you're familiar with and what resonates with you. Also what is familiar and resonates with your clients. They may be used to using a particular tool through their corporate career and already have kind of an extensive understanding. And it's always good to check back because that does evolve over time and as people develop, but also ensuring that there is some rigor so that you are not kind of constantly chasing a new certification, investing your time and your focus on things that may not be that practically applicable to the coaching work that you are actually doing. That also is a type of coach development and maturity is understanding more about what will serve your clients in the best way. So it's a competency that you effectively need to build.
Yeah, absolutely.
So if you think of it in a similar vein, are there some tools that are easier or more versatile for a coach who is newer into their coaching practice to lean on or explore further?
Oh, I think that's tricky. I suppose conceptually, when we're starting out in our journey, I suppose two things. When we're starting out in our journey, it is tempting to think that the more different tools I have, the better I'll be. And perhaps this is counterintuitive, but I would argue that the tools that you already use, you can become much more artful with them and that is probably more value than adding in a new one. The exception to that would be as if there's clearly a gap in your armory, then yes, bring something in. But don't assume that you have to have, loads of tools in the toolbox. First of all, really leverage the ones that you've got. And it's kind of when you get really bored with them and know that actually, oh my gosh, here I am offering this again, there must be something else. Then that's a good time to say, let's go and find something that is similar but different, or something that would complement this. And I'd always say to people as well, I continue to use something like the Wheel of Life. It was one of the first things I ever did as a coach, and I am so bored with it in a way. But that doesn't mean to say it's not a really good tool for some clients. And so I have to get over myself and say, yeah, this will be the 1,000th time that I've used this, but actually it's going to be a really useful tool for this particular person because they've not seen it before and they will get some insight. So I think there's this tension between wanting to fill our toolboxes with lots of exciting things and actually getting really good with the existing tools that we've got. I think if we do want to build our tool set, then sometimes there is, when I was talking about what does your training school offer you and what didn't you like, if there's something in there that you didn't like, and that probably means there's a gap at some stage of the life cycle of coaching. So what else would fill that? So then you could strategically talk to your network or Google it and think, well, what else could I use that would fill that gap? Most coaching schools will come from a particular philosophy. So if you're liking generally the philosophy of the coaching school, then research what might also fit within that philosophy, because that's an extension then. You're using the same mindset, but slightly different tools. Then I think when you're a more mature practitioner, there's the opportunity for counterbalance. So I've got a great personal example of that where I class myself as a fairly non-directive coach, but I am also quite pragmatic, and there'll be times when I think this is a blind spot for somebody. Let me share what I'm noticing and let me see if that kind of gets us somewhere. And I was beginning to notice that I was enjoying a little bit too much being the mentor, the expert, when in fact what I was supposed to be doing was coaching. And my sense was, rather than stop myself being directive, I engaged in some thinking environment training, which helped me be more non-directive. So that wasn't stopping me doing stuff. I was starting to do something else. And the result was a lovely counterbalance. So I was actively choosing to ensure that in my armory, I could allow myself to be directive if that felt appropriate. But actually, I could also enjoy going to the other end of the spectrum and being much more non-directive and allowing the thinker to do all of the work. So that was a kind of mature decision, recognizing what was happening in my practice and knowingly bringing in something to counterbalance it.
One of the things you've spoken about before, I think, leads into this, I think, quite nicely. And so it's perhaps a good point in the conversation to bring that up. And that is the difference between a more inquiry-based method versus a more emergent method. How does that apply within the use of tools within your experience, both coaching and from a supervising position?
Yeah. So I guess what we've got going on there is, what feels natural for the coach, and that would help them deepen their either their armory of tools and techniques, or deepen their sense of comfort with just going wherever it is. Then you've got to overlay, and what does this particular client want? Because we've got to be prepared to move out of that depending on what we meet. And again, I'd go back to different philosophies will encourage more or less. If you look at something like CBT, you're quite reliant on techniques. If you look at something that is more humanistic and Rogerian, you'd just be relying on the coach's tool and, just an emergent conversation. So this is where, for me at least, philosophy so much is the bedrock of where you go next.
Absolutely. What do you feel makes a good coaching tool? How are they at their most powerful?
Yeah. Well, you only know when it's happened, of course.
Of course.
And that's about, for me, it's about insight and momentum. So a good coaching tool will take somebody to somewhere they've not been before, and it will mobilize something. And I go back to where I started. I don't think there is a tool that reliably does that. It's the sweet spot when, favorite tool meets favorite client meets favorite opportunity, and it all comes together. We have to be prepared to experiment a bit, and then that's where over time our hunches perhaps get a bit more accurate about which tool at which time with which client are likely to have the biggest impact.
Following on in that theme, you eventually recognize and start to build up a pattern of behavior, or as you build your relationship with the particular client or team, if you're looking at it from a team coaching perspective, I'm sure you get a sense of which tools will resonate with them. Does the application of tools change during the kind of client relationship and kind of life cycle of the coaching, or is it something that's a little bit more static and fixed?
Yeah, I guess there is certainly a kind of cohort of coaches that would say, bring certainly the psychometrics or the kind of more assessment type questionnaires at the start. That gives you lots of data upon which you can feed. I've always sometimes I work as an associate, so I don't have a choice. But if I'm working in my own business, I would tend to get started, get the rapport going, really understand what the issues might be that are holding people back, and then decide upon the questionnaires. Because I'm sure I'm not the only coach that, the espoused goal is this, and two sessions in, you're thinking, that's really not what we need to be working on. So, you can get over-invested in some data that was perhaps mined with a particular objective in mind, when actually the objective that you will give you reap most reward is slightly different, and better to invest the time with the psychometrics and the tools slightly later, because actually you're working with I will often talk about the iceberg, you see the top, but actually there's so much more underneath. So I would like to use psychometrics with the body of the iceberg, not just the tip. And I think in terms of more kind of not psychometrics, but other tools and methods, that's for me is a very kind of ad hoc decision. You will notice something occurring in the dialogue and you're thinking, now we need to open this up. How can we open it up? And sometimes, a series of questions might be sufficient. Other times you think, no, we need to codify this. We need some structure. We need a framework. We need a language, perhaps. And then you'll bring something in. And I do think, little advert for supervision here, if you're in group supervision, that's a wonderful thing to bring. So you're working with a client, you're kind of sensing that there's something over here that it would be helpful to access more. You might not have something obvious in your armory to know how to open that up. Bringing that to supervision, and especially group supervision, other people can pool ideas on what they've done in similar situations. So that can help build your toolbox in a fairly timely fashion for your client that's got this thing that you just want to unpick a little bit.
So it seems that discovery is an important part of using tools, and just ensuring that you are coming at their use from a place of curiosity and kind of connection to the client and the situation, but also that you are approaching it in a flexible fashion so that you're able to address the tool or the technique to the situation and adapt it if it needs to be done, which I think is a great consideration as you think of how they can go. We talked about some very specific tools in terms of the psychometrics and various tests and assessments. What else do we mean by tools? What else is out there that people might be coming across? I was introduced to creative techniques within my coaching training, and it was a huge kind of body of different tips, tricks, tools. And, like you, I have ones that I have kind of attached myself to and are almost old faithful friends, and others that, I would still be exploring, and thousands more out there. But what other kind of common families, if such a thing exists, for tools?
Yeah, I guess I would encourage people to think about our learning preferences. So in organizations, often the dominant force is cognition. So it's logic, it's frameworks, it's analyses. So all of those are great things. And sometimes we need to sort of solve the problem from a different place from which it's been invented. So then I'd be encouraging people to think about things like, well, what's visual? So, picture cards, storyboards, drawing, anything that invokes a more visual approach to problem solving. Auditory is also a really key processing style. So, we can use metaphor to think, so, if this was a song, which one would you choose, or we can actually create playlists to help people think differently. There's all sorts of soundscapes available too now. So lockdown wasn't that long ago, was it? But, we talk about walking coaching and going out in nature. Well, now there's soundscapes that can take you up a mountain or through rivers, or, all of this might invoke something that's a little bit of a catalyst for something different. So visual, auditory, kinesthetic. So, movement. The Gestalt tradition uses a lot of sort of somatic responses and noticing small movements that you just emphasize a little and see what that might mean. So often people try to think with their head or know with their head, forgetting that the rest of our body holds information. So that's a really useful thing when people get mentally stuck, to invite them and say, what does the rest of your body know about this? Now, granted, you might need to contract for that, and some people might find that a very weird question. But, we know that our whole organism experiences stuff, knows stuff. So tools that really invoke people to inspect their more somatic experience can be useful. And then I think things like poetry, like, I came across the poem I mentioned earlier because of the reflective work that I'm doing. And actually, Judy Brown has done a whole book on reflective practice for leaders. So I think increasingly the arts are useful to bring into our coaching, because it jostles our current way of seeing the world and invites us to respond to something that we might not understand at the moment, but there's a kernel of something that might take us in a different direction. So those would be my kind of suggestions, to think about the different learning styles and think about, okay, so how might I bring more visual tools into my practice, or how might I bring more mindful or somatic tools into my practice, and build your toolbox that way.
It's a great description, because it does also show us by the categories you're sharing and some of the examples that this is an almost inexhaustive landscape of tools that can be used, that can be adapted to the situation, to the individual. Almost, if you're using a tool or technique to help someone get over something, or they're particularly stuck, the tools and techniques that you use and you get yourself through that process are also you kind of an endless constellation of other interventions, and also take your coaching program in quite a different direction based on the situations you apply. Something that seems to be growing and changing and inspired by so many other things. So it's a great privilege to work in an industry where there is that room for creativity, for flexibility in the application of the practices, and it's exciting to kind of hear more. I'm going to ask you a question that is almost like the favorite child question. Are there tools that you particularly enjoy using? You mentioned the Wheel of Life and how it's kind of an old stalwart, but are there others that are kind of go-tos for you over the years?
Yeah, I think I'm quite visual, and so literally I have on my desk a pack of picture cards. They were created by a colleague of mine, and I actually send my clients a pack of those cards when we start working together so that we both have the same resources. And that can be a lovely way of signaling that what we're about to do isn't a normal business meeting. This is something else. This is entering into a different territory, and inviting them to take a moment or two, select a card that says something about how they're arriving today. And, that's a beautiful entry point into a different kind of dialogue. And, having said that, some people go, no, nothing of this is speaking to me. So again, like I said right at the start, as wonderful as I think they are, I have to be prepared to let go of it if the client isn't visual, or they just can't be asked on that day, to leaf through things. They just want to dump some thoughts before we do anything constructive. So that is my go-to. It's on my desk. I use it a lot. A lot of the work I do is in organizations, and I can't remember how many years ago it was now, but not right at the start of my journey, probably somewhere in the middle. I did a constellations training, and that is so useful to just help people map out what's in their brain, look at what's involved in the complexity of what they're facing, and then we can break it down and focus on certain parts of the map, or move things around. And yeah, I would not be without that for sure. And then I suppose, again, because, a lot of the work I do is on people that have tricky working relationships. When we talk about psychometrics, sometimes people think, oh, well, if I'm going to do it, I've got to do the whole questionnaire and they've got to have the results, I've got to do feedback session. The MBTI was something I was trained on a long time ago, and its structure is in my head. So I will often use its structure to form questions. So they haven't done an MBTI profile, but I would say, it sounds to me these are the kind of preferences you would have. Would you say that the person you've got difficulty has got preferences like this? And in my mind, I'm mapping out a dimension of the tool, and that is informing the dialogue. They just haven't done the profile. I know it well enough to help them think about what their differences are. So those are probably the three things that I wouldn't want to do without.
Well, thank you for sharing those. I think it's also a good reminder that sometimes there is a common kind of professional lexicon. People will have used these tools, and you might know, for me, MBTI is another one that from the earliest days of my career, and I do think in those terms. And as a newer coach, almost that kind of safety in the familiar is a great place to start as you start to build up that toolkit. And the notion of building a toolkit is a great one. How should the development of tools figure into, continuing professional development for coaches?
I really think that's an individual choice. And I guess what we need to get good at as a practitioner is noticing themes and patterns in how we are working with clients. So, if there's a freshness to our assignments, that probably says we've got a nice array of tools that we can pull on. If we're becoming a bit habituated, maybe a little bit repetitive, that's a signal that maybe we need some fresh blood, some new tools coming into our armory. And there's something about, maybe we don't need any more at all. Maybe, we need to just leverage what we have if what we seem to be getting is continually good results. So I think You said earlier on about how bombarded we can be with, marketing from different providers about this next whizzy tool. Well, none of us want to miss out, do we? But actually, do we really need it? I think this is what I mean by looking at themes and patterns. If there's a sort of a fatigue in our practice, then bringing in a new tool is a lovely way of refreshing it. But actually, maybe we already have everything we need. And certainly I would encourage people, if they're feeling it's a bit samey, go back to their training. What did they learn but haven't used? Because it may be that you've already got something hiding in the cupboards that could just needs a bit of a dust off and you'll be away. Other times you've kind of done a complete stock check and you're still thinking, nope, it feels like there's more. I guess what I'm saying is be driven by your needs, not the market's marketing. Having said that, the market does kind of notice when there's trends. There became to be more emotional intelligence tools at one point. There was much more resilience tools at another. We were looking much more at well-being. So, listen to the market and think, well, how would I tackle that when it comes up with my clients? And maybe you already have something and maybe you don't. If you're finding times when a topic comes up and you don't feel well equipped to deal with it, well, that's a sign that maybe a new tool is really helpful. I think we have to be driven by our needs, not what the market is suggesting we should have.
I think that's great guidance in that space where you're newer into the industry, you're trying to build your credibility, trying to build a client base, trying to build your skills above all else, to be led by what is necessary for your practice to deliver the best outcomes for your clients. You mentioned a number of sources already where you can find out or learn new techniques and tools. So you mentioned the power of supervision and also kind of going back to your coach training and dusting that off and looking at some areas that you maybe are aware of in your unconsciousness but have not deployed yet. What other sources are there for learning new techniques?
So, there's no shortage of books. Google it, Amazon it, you'll find stuff. What I would guide people towards, though, is things like the co-coaching community, where other people will have road tested stuff. And, actually, if there's something out there that a number of people have road tested and everybody's saying this is really good, then that's a hint that it might be useful for you too. Not necessarily, but I think co-coaching communities are great sources of. You can't possibly keep a handle on everything that's going on, but together as a community, you will spot trends and you can learn from your colleagues. Each training school is different in how it manages its alumni, but a lot of them will offer kind of ongoing CPD events that bring in speakers or bring in tools that maybe they're now presented in their programs but weren't when you were part of it. And I think what are the brands that you trust? Go to other organisations, universities, publishers that you think are credible and fit your particular market. And you have to do some research. If you're an executive coach working with leaders, it's probably worth having a subscription to HBR, because that'll be scanning the environment for you to know what's hot in that world. If, on the other hand, you're in outplacement counselling, then you need to be finding resources that are going to be supporting that. And HBR might be a wasted subscription. So horses for courses.
I think that's been a common theme through our discussion is looking towards yourself and what will resonate with you and is going to be a practical tool, a good solid extension of the work that you're doing and grounding your tools and techniques in that. So what will serve your client, but also have that kind of resonance with you. And I'm sure as with anything is where you are finding something that is resonant and powerful. You'll be more engaged and you'll be able to build up your skills. But as you mentioned a few times in the conversation, it's also about continuing to develop those tools and techniques, looking at how they're working, how your clients are reacting, what's topical within the sector you're working in, and continuing to kind of flex your coaching tool muscles as you go, which I think is a really important reminder for all of us. maybe this is a huge question, but what does make a good tool? How do you know?
I think there's a few things rolling through my mind. There's some of the things we've not talked about is when you shouldn't use a tool. So, for example, we shouldn't use a tool if the client is resisting it. So, even it might be the best tool in the world for client you saw yesterday, doesn't mean it's going to be right for today. So we should not push a tool if we are getting data that says not today. I think the other time when we shouldn't use a tool is when we are stuck and we think it's an easy way forward. Oh, I'm not sure what to do now. Right, let me bring in the wheel of life because I know that works. That's probably the worst time we can use a tool because that's about what we're doing it for us, not for the client. And so, the best tool is the reverse of that. It's something that is engaging for the client, and it's something that is absolutely in service of the client. And that's kind of reminding me of a framework that I've talked about elsewhere. There are three things that I think we should be observing when we're deciding or offering a tool. There's 3 C's. So the first one is contracting. Is the use of tools in general, and this tool in particular, in our contract? And if not, we need to do that before we take our next step. The second one is, do we have the competence and capability to deliver it? So that's back to my hobby horse of, we shouldn't be doing this as a punt with a client. We should be practiced enough to know that, when we get halfway through and things are a little bit sticky, what are we going to do next? What would we do to carry on? What would we do to double back? So there needs to be an element of competency around and competence with that tool. And the third one is the client's best interest, which is back to my don't use a tool because you're panicking and you think it's a way out. You need to be serving your client in that moment. And perhaps the best thing you can do in that moment, say, I'm feeling a bit stuck here. That's genuine. Just covering it with offering a tool is not helpful, and it's probably not in the client's best interest. So those would be the 3 tests about how useful any tool might be in that moment.
Great. So before you plunge ahead with the tool is checking that you have contracted for it, ensuring that you're competent in it, but also confident to use it, and ensuring that it always fulfills the client's needs so that you are serving the client first and foremost with the use of that tool. And as you've said throughout the conversation, there's a time and a place, and that should be carefully considered as you move into it. Maybe a 4th C there with the consideration.
Yeah.
But I think that's tremendously helpful as we think about how tools can be additive to your coaching practice. And I'm going to ask you for one final piece of wisdom, Michelle, and that is, what is that one pearl of wisdom that you would offer a new coach?
I guess I recognize there's a magpie in all of us. We'd love to have an assortment of tools. The bigger, the better. We all have a fear of missing out, but don't let that obscure the fact that the very best tool you'll ever have is yourself.
Fantastic. That's such a poignant reminder of the power of the coaching relationship and what the coach can bring into that relationship and that transformative, evolutionary process, as you spoke to at the beginning of the conversation with the poem and that kind of breakthrough and that growth and development. Thanks so much, Michelle. I've taken a lot from our conversation today. I think the 3 C's framework of contracting, competence, and serving your client's needs is a fantastic framework when we're considering how to use tools. And I know that that's something that will be of great value for me in my coaching practice. I also love how you've positioned the use of tools and techniques as a philosophy and really looking at how a particular tool or technique or a suite of tools resonates with me and above all serves my client's needs. And within that, how important it is to look for cues from your client to see what's working, what mood they may be in, and really being mindful to the tools that I'm going to bring into our coaching dialogues, and ensuring that those always will serve the client needs. So as I build up my toolkit, these are great tips and a super framework to ensure that I'm picking those which are going to best serve my clients, but also are going to be a powerful and enjoyable solution for me to leverage. So you have given us a fantastic overview of some of the kind of great coaching tools and techniques, but also the considerations a coach should have in using them and how you can identify what's going to work and which ones would work best for you. Where can people go to find out more about your work and get in touch with you?
Well, I've got a LinkedIn profile. There's lots of information there. I've got a website which is www.greenfieldsconsultancy.co.uk. That's my business. And given we're talking about tools and techniques, this is a good read. I think if you use code EFL02 on the Routledge site, you will get 20% off that title. It is written with supervision in mind, but at the end of them all, we talk about how might you use this with your clients. And what I wanted to achieve with this book was one of my messages earlier on today, which is know your philosophy first, then bring the tools in to support it. And it's got 10 philosophies with a range of tools that are congruent with that particular way of thinking. So in there, you'll get a sense of who I am as well.
Fantastic. We'll ensure that we put a link to the 101 coaching supervision techniques, approaches, inquiries, and experiments,
Longest
as well as
in the world, yeah,
but that's okay, as well as your other books. And thank you for the generous code as well. And we'll also include in the show notes a number of the references and the links that you've made through the conversation. I know that they will all be a massive help to new coaches or those who are wondering more about how they can build their practice using tools and techniques. So a huge thank you, Michelle, for being the guest on today's episode of Getting Started as a Coach.
Well, thank you for asking me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for listening to another podcast by the Association for Coaching. For 20 years, our purpose has been to inspire and champion coaching excellence, advance the coaching profession, and make a sustainable difference to individuals, organizations, and society. To find out more about the AC and our member benefits, follow us on LinkedIn or explore our webpage at associationforcoaching.com. There, you can keep up to date with our latest podcast episodes, enjoy the wealth of digital learning offerings, and gain insights from our Coaching Perspectives magazine.